Hello, good morning. Good morning and welcome. I'd like to welcome you all to the Color of Membership, which is part of the 3-year Shakespearean Futures initiative. I'm Michael Witmore. I'm the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. And if I may, before we get started, I would like to invite Trustee Erica Lynn to the podium just to say a little bit about the initiative itself. Erica?
Hi, thank you all. I'm really excited to be here. I was a member of the program committee working on this 3-year initiative, which is going to be renewable, called Shakespearean Futures. This is the inaugural session. The goal of this initiative is to think about institutional and material conditions that affect our intellectual lives. We have a tripartite structure, so typically there will be outreach before the conference begins, then there'll be the conference session, followed by feedback so that we can invite membership participation in outcomes and communication that on issues that arise as a result of the session. Anyhow, I just want to say we welcome member-driven initiatives such as this. I was a member when I started this. I'm now an incoming trustee. But anyways, and so I'm really happy for this inaugural session where there's actually going to be feedback invited afterwards, and hope you all participate and come to trustees with future suggestions to increase inclusion and outreach and communication. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Erica. So for those of you who use social media, the hashtag ShaxFutures17 has been set aside for conversation following this panel, and I think the other URL there is a survey that's been created, an anonymous survey for membership, so please have a look at that. Because this session is about membership, it's also about institutions, and I wanted to say a word about institutions since it's something I think about a lot as director of the Folger. Institutions are larger than individuals, and that's why they stick around. But institutions also need to reflect and amplify the voices of their members, and membership changes. I'm reminded in a very different context of the inaugural 1932 lecture by the first director of the Folger, Joseph Quincy Adams, who declared that the Folger had been created to combat, quote, the forces of immigration, unquote, which he believed were, again quoting, a menace to the preservation of our long-established English nation, unquote. Adams couldn't have been more wrong about the reasons for the library's existence, or about the nature of the evolving link between Americans and Shakespeare. The fate of those claims, which were made before the President of the United States and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, shows that most institutional prophecies are susceptible to irony. So a conversation at the SAA about the color of membership is vital because it focuses attention on some of those ironies that are now generated by the puzzle of race. Each of our 5 speakers will present an 8-minute paper taking up approximately 40 minutes of our panel session. Then we'll have crosstalk among our panelists for about 20 minutes. We'll then open up to about 20 minutes of addresses or of questions from the audience. I would ask that you ask your question of the entire panel. I'm going to introduce our speakers, our 5 speakers in order, and I note that because of the weather, we'll have 2 surrogates presenting our panelists' papers because Denis, Britton, and Jean Howard were unable to come here because of the weather. So our 5 speakers. Denis Austin Britton is Associate Professor of English at the University of New Hampshire. He's author of Becoming Christian, Race, Reformation, and Early Modern English Romance. With Melissa Walters, he's co-editing a collection of essays entitled Rethinking Shakespeare's Source Study, Author, Audiences, and Digital Technologies, expected from Routledge later this year. He's also working on a book entitled Shakespeare and Pity, Feeling Human Difference in Early Modern English Drama. His paper will be delivered by David Sterling Brown. David is assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Arizona, where he teaches Shakespeare and early modern English literature. He's a graduate of New York University's English and American Literature PhD program. Going second will be Arthur Little, Jr. He is an associate professor in English at UCLA. He is author of Shakespeare Jungle Fever, National Imperial Revisions of Race, Rape, and Sacrifice, and a recent essay in Shakespeare Quarterly entitling Rehistoricizing Race, White Melancholia, and the Shakespearean Property. He's also author of Shakespeare and Race Theory, which is forthcoming from Bloomsbury, and editor of the soon-to-be published essay collection, White People in Shakespeare. Jyotsna Singh is professor in the English department at Michigan State University. She's author of Colonial Narratives, Cultural Dialogues, Discoveries of India in the Language of Colonialism. Currently, she is at work on 2 book projects, Shakespeare and Post-Colonial Theory, and a monograph in progress called Transcultural Islam, Muslim and Christian Identities in Mughal India and Early Modern England. Next, Jean Howard is George Delacorte Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University and author most recently of Marx and Shakespeare in the Great Shakespearean series, co-written with Crystal Bartolovich. She is completing a new book, Staging History, Forging the Body Politic, that considers the different genealogies of the history play in America and England in the 20th and 21st centuries. Her paper will be read by Patricia Cahill, who is Associate Professor of English at Emory University, author of Unto the Breach, Martial Formation, Historical Trauma, and the Early Modern Stage. With Kim Hall, she's leading a seminar this afternoon on Shakespeare in Black America. Finally, Joyce Green MacDonald is Associate Professor of English at the University of Kentucky. She's the author of Women and Race in Early Modern Texts and has published several articles on race and performance in Renaissance studies, in Renaissance drama, and on Shakespearean adaptation in the United States. Her current project is a book called New World Shakespeares, which especially focuses on Black women as authors of and figures in Shakespearean adaptation. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Denis Austin Britton, whose paper will be read by David Sterling Brown.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to read this paper on Denis's behalf, Ain't She a Shakespearean? It will be obvious to many that my title signifies on Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech, delivered at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention on May 29, 1851. In the speech, Truth responds to male hecklers who wanted to deny women the right to vote. But more than that, the critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw notes that when Truth tells her audience, quote, "I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman?" End quote. She is using her personal history as an enslaved Black woman to illustrate that she, as a woman, is just as strong and capable as any man, while simultaneously critiquing the suffragist categorization of woman. Truth makes it clear that the seemingly non-racialized category of woman was indeed racialized to mean white women, that one can be a woman and still not be counted as a woman. I begin with Truth in order to interrogate another category that may not seem to be racialized, the category being Shakespearean. I wonder, does everyone who writes on and researches Shakespeare get to be considered a Shakespearean? To what extent does Shakespeare's studies and all the power and prestige that is associated with the scholarly study of Shakespeare fully embrace the study of race in and through Shakespeare? Does the scholarship on race in the early modern period, even when it is primarily on Shakespeare, get to be counted as Shakespeare scholarship? And finally, can we consider Nikki Giovanni a Shakespearean? When we think of Nikki Giovanni, we likely think of an African-American poet who played an important role in the Black arts movement. Few, if any, will recall that in 1990, she published a very short essay in the journal The Upstart Crow entitled Giovanni on Shakespeare. Her essay appears first in a volume that includes titles of the kind that we expect to see in Shakespeare journals. For example, Political and Poetic Revisionism in Julius Caesar, An Enemy in Their Mouths, The Closure of Language in Othello, Macbeth and Death, Paranoia and Primogeniture. In her essay, Giovanni, among other things, provides a type of historicist reading of Shakespeare, admiring him for his ability to call the king a tyrant and not get his head cut off. But my question today is, why would Giovanni care to publish anything in a Shakespeare journal? Shakespeare journals have a limited and specialized audience, and in 1990, there was little to indicate that there would have been an audience for the racial critique she offers, not of Shakespeare himself, but of scholarship done on Shakespeare. Anya Lumba's Gender, Race, Renaissance Drama was published just the year before, in 1989. Margot Hendricks and Patricia Parker's edited collection, Women, Race, and Writing, was published in 1994, and Kim Hall's Things of Darkness in 1995. Nevertheless, if Nikki Giovanni published in a Shakespeare journal, we must assume that she had something she wanted to say to Shakespeareans. I believe that she has a word for us today as members of the SAA. Giovanni envies Shakespeare. She writes in her essay, quote, "Shakespeare is lucky. There is an old African saying, 'You are not dead until you are forgotten.' Many groups share that. So do some American Indians. The Euro-American must believe it because he worked so hard to keep his history alive. It's fine by me. I hope, like Shakespeare, to one day be a Jeopardy subject. I hope that high school seniors quake at the fact that they have to take Giovanni before they graduate. I certainly can see the controversy over who actually wrote my poems. Why did I never receive a major poetry award? These things get many a professor tenured, keeping many a family fed. One might even win promotion to full with the lucky and unusual discovery of some obscure grocery list, proving once and for all, until deconstruction, that I do have false teeth. These things matter," end quote. Giovanni imagines what it would be like to be institutionalized in the same way that Shakespeare is, to be of such importance that entire careers, promotion to full, and feeding one's family could be centered upon her writing. But it's important to remember that Giovanni's fantasy, published as it is in a Shakespeare journal, and thus likely to be read only by Shakespeareans, also provides a powerful critique of the type of scholarship that is deemed as mattering. Giovanni imagines scholars doing the same type of scholarship on her that we often find ourselves doing on Shakespeare: questions of authorship, reception, archival work, and fashionable theoretical paradigms. But in all of this, Giovanni draws our attention to the fact that scholarly inquiry is mediated by racial and economic forces. The scholarship that matters is that which leads to career advancement and money to feed the family. Moreover, the scholarship that matters is that which helps to keep Euro-American history alive, most often at the expense of other histories. Giovanni's essay provides us with numerous lessons, but the main lesson she has for us today, as we, the Shakespeareans, think about the color of membership, is that our consideration of what matters in Shakespeare studies and in the SAA does not exist outside of the racial and economic realities in which we all live. Giovanni admires Shakespeare, but she is critical of how the Shakespeareans define what matters and what doesn't. Although her essay is primarily questioning narratives of Shakespeare's exceptionalism that make her own poetry invisible, I do not think it a stretch to use her essay to help us think about who gets to be considered a Shakespearean scholar. If one clicks on the link Shakespearean Scholar on Shakespeare Online, one will be immediately struck by the fact that the list is dominated by dead white men. The Wikipedia entry, Shakespearean Scholar, doesn't do much better. of the 164 scholars listed, a list that includes numerous white women and probably a few people that might be in the room today, only 3 non-white scholars make the cut. Giovanni did not make that list, nor did any Black or Indian scholars, nor did any of the scholars, any of color, that I turned to help me think about race in Shakespeare and in the early modern period. The Wikipedia list at least has the disclaimer, quote, "This list might not reflect recent changes," end quote. But the absence of Black, Indian, and scholars who might work on race from the list suggests to me that not everyone who works on Shakespeare gets to be considered a Shakespearean. I would ask us, SAA, are we okay with that? I seriously hope not. So now, what are we going to do? Thank you.
The quotation, good afternoon, by the way, and thank all of you for coming out. The quotation at the bottom of the screen is one that I heard yesterday while I was having lunch, and 2 of my white colleagues, unbeknownst to them that I was sitting there, were going through the program, and they started to very deliberately and with a bit of sickness to read through all the titles of this particular session. And then one of them turned to the other and said, in case this is not clear, 2 middle-aged white men. And one of them said, "Are you going to that?" And the other said, "I'm not very interested in that stuff." And what made it even a little more chilling was the fact that that ended the discussion. And so there was no follow-up, there was no second response, as though they both clearly understood what that meant. And so the containment of that, I thought, was quite appropriate for what it is we're actually doing here today as we talk about that stuff. I was also thinking as I started, and I'm going to take the liberty because I spent a lot of time organizing this, so I'm going to take the liberty and cheat a little now that I'm at the podium. I won't go too much longer, but I will go just over just a little, forgive me, here because of something else I wanted to add to get started here. And that was, as I was thinking about this session, and I wanted to, as I have so often done in other arenas, to in some ways get personal, which is in part what my paper is about. And I thought, and I started to think through various things and to wonder whether those things were actually personal, such as, for example, as an undergraduate student who was studying Shakespeare and had my Shakespeare professor come up to me after class, and who I didn't know knew of my existence, and say to me, your professors, I've spoken to several of your other professors, and they're very impressed, or they say they're very impressed with your work. I just want you to know that I am not impressed. So that was my collegial, or whatever you call it, introduction to Shakespeare. I was carrying that forward and wondering, as I was working on this paper, whether that was personal. To jump ahead to my days at UCLA, where I am currently, to find out, being a very excited, at that point, assistant professor, getting his first book published, having my book put in our department case, which is where I assume a lot of you in departments where you display the books from the faculty in the department, only to have my book returned to me 2 weeks later because the chair said he didn't have room in the case for displaying my work. Is that personal? I was also wondering whether my love for Shakespeare, which was really engendered by my grandmother at a very young age, whether that is personal. Sit with that. My title is meant to, oh, where's my clicker? I'm sorry, it's over here.
Here it is.
I assume we're in a room of Shakespeareans. You also know the illusion here, but just in case. All right. Was Shakespeare to him or he to Shakespeare? My title is meant to encapsulate a personal problem, one posed as a question I have repeatedly heard over my career, sometimes quite directly to my face, but most often behind my back and through innuendo and officiousness, and one that continues to be off-balancing. Strategically deployed, consciously or unconsciously, this personal constricts and incarcerates. As Indira Kamarchetti has noted in her essay, Caliban in the Classroom, scholars of color in general are encased in the personal, as especially evidenced by the visible fact of our visible selves, we walking exemplars of ethnicity and of race. The question accuses. The he of the question, working as he does in Shakespeare studies, has broken the phenomenological fit that, quote, matches race with subject, the disciplining and containing of ethnicity into its proper and personal field. And because so many of us Shakespeare and early modern scholars of color work to varying degrees on matters of race, it becomes all too easy for our inquisitors to relegate not just us, but our work back to the discretely personal, where this personal already conveniently and consensually has inscribed in it a sense of the pathological. Tim Wise has argued that this act of keeping people of color off balance is a way, too, of keeping whites in control. A truism, he argues in his brilliantly incisive essay, Membership Has Its Privileges. This tacit and tactical deployment of an impersonal, meaning authoritatively personal, white privilege becomes a shorthanded way of claiming a phenomenological or osmotic fit between Shakespeare and the white scholar, even as so many of these same white scholars are confident in the racelessness, not just of Shakespeare, but in their own scholarly practices. Our work, our inquisitors know, underscores a truth about ourselves, that, quote, we are the local and the regional, as opposed to the universality of the West, nature to its culture, instinct to its intellect, body to its brain. Our personal bodies and our personal scholarship stand in opposition to the universal and the institutional, to the humanist principles so central to so much of the work we carry out in Shakespeare's name. Of course, such logic strategically forgets the white scholars in Shakespeare in early modern race studies. But the problem here isn't about the personal itself. After all, the authoritatively personal, I began with the desire to speak to the dead, ushers in nearly 30 years of scholarship in which, as H. Aaron Wieser has argued, quote, the personal, even the autobiographical investigative project proceeds from an unabashed passion, nor is that passion bland or banal, end of quote. So something else is going on with the charge levied against the scholar of color, for whom the accusatory personal instantiates what slavery historian Orlando Patterson would recognize as an enactment of social death, the production of a consumptive rather than a generative passion. It's the personal, not as an instantiation of the universal, but as an alienation from it. Ayanna Thompson may be right when she opines, if Shakespeare studies were to support the inclusion of race studies more systematically and consistently, then our ranks may diversify more rapidly and thoroughly. But it isn't just inclusion, providing a more institutionally and intellectually open environment that's called for. What we need more immediately is a more sustained understanding and critique of our Shakespeare business and its intellectual and institutional practices. I would argue that in no other literary field does the relationship between the personal and the institutional play out in such an intimate fashion. And the awesome responsibility this entails, I'm not interested in that stuff, has been repeatedly and irresponsibly too often relegated to the personal, whether the personal is gendered, raced, classed, queered, even though my focus here today is on the personalization of race, where the personalization of race means, in very real terms, non-white. And a very exciting chapter was Hecuba to him on Hamlet, education, rhetoric, discipline, and the transforming of schoolboys from beasts into gentlemen. Lynn Interling, in her book, Shakespeare's Schoolroom, has argued that Shakespeare's poeticizing, quote, humanism's institutionalized method for achieving hegemony by consent rather than force, that is, by training schoolboys to, quote, imitate someone else's passion, allows Shakespeare, she says, to produce the effects of inwardness, of intense personal feeling, which she argues has long been recognized as characteristic of his texts. In fact, Shakespeare, in all its thick cultural signification, doesn't just present the exemplary embodiment of this preeminent personal, the effects of inwardness, of intense personal feeling, has a very long history in Western discourse. It, of course, underwrites institutional narratives of modernity. It also, and this is what I meant in my use of the phrase intimate relationship a few moments ago, it also underwrites the personal narration of Black lives that have, during the same period, been read at best as aping such feelings, such inwardness. Our field locates this intense personal feeling in white-raced bodies whose whiteness is rarely unmasked or unpacked. While new historicism, for example, could observe and unmask the institutional impersonality of an older criticism, Louis A. Montrose's lament remains only slightly less true now than it did in the late 1980s. Quote, a gentlemanly, that is, a benignly patriarchal Anglo-Saxon Protestant humanist ethos remains still today one deeply ingrained in the interpretive community of English Renaissance studies, end of quote. That is, whiteness by another name. Put differently, there's a very real need for white scholars in our field to recognize and interrogate the very real professional and institutional workings of what Interling reads as melancholic identification, or what I've elsewhere called white melancholia. We need, too, a more ethical outing of what Interling calls the habits of alterity implicit in school and institutional training, so that when read carefully, we may be better equipped to trouble any claim of the institution's seamless production of gentlemen with a univocally white ego. This need is nothing new, even though the field has worked as if by consensus to repeatedly pathologically personalize the issues and the stakes. It's worth remembering and reflecting on G.K. Hunter, who delivered in his own personal and passionate reflections on white melancholia in a changing world almost 50 years ago exactly today, that is on April 19th, 1967, in an address delivered to the members of the British Academy, who we may say were those schoolboys now successfully transformed into gentlemen. 50 years on, it's fair to ask, with a bit of transporting, where are we now? There has, of course, been an incredible body of scholarship and historical breakthroughs since then, and not in spite of, but even more importantly, in light of such remarkable scholarship, where are we now institutionally? For Hunter, who in the wake of the 1963 Robbins Report was one of those tasked with tackling elitism, gender discrimination, and class and culture prejudice in higher education by widening participation, that is, by establishing from the ground up 7 new universities in the UK. 2 of his obituaries described Hunter's main achievement as his imagining a new humanities ethos for a changing world. For us here in this room today, Hunter's essay, Othello and Color Prejudice, is very apropos, because more than a lucid and provocative reading of Shakespeare's play, Hunter clearly signifies on the Academy its elitist membership, very carefully orchestrating a reading, stages an intervention, performs a kind of intellectual activism by deploying very thinly veiled misdirection to ask the Academy about its place in a changing world. I'm almost to the end of this. Quote, the modern theater-going European intellectual with a background of cultivated superiority of color problems in other continents would often choose to regard Othello as a fellow man and to watch the story, which could so easily be reduced to its headline level. Sheltered white girl said, color does not matter, with a sense of freedom from such prejudices. But this lofty fair-mindedness may be too lofty for Shakespeare's play and not take the European any nearer the Othello of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was clearly deliberate in keeping Othello's color, and it is obvious that he counted on some positive audience reaction to this color. But it is equally obvious that he did not wish the audience to dismiss Othello as a stereotype nigger. That last phrase, I would argue, was meant not just to throw Hunter's audience off balance, to recall, or in my audience, to recall Tim Wise's phrase, but to get personal. Nigger has a way of breaking through and especially exposing the stuff of whites. It was meant to punctuate and puncture his central thesis by bringing into more gentlemanly halls of the British Academy those persons outside it. After all, color problems weren't just on other continents, presumably North America, but were very close at hand, as evidenced by the summer 1958 London race riots, the 1962 Commonwealth Immigration Act, the 1965 Race Relations Act, and the ongoing racial unrest through the 1960s. In other words, Hunter brings in Shakespeare and Shakespeare's play to do institutional work, to call attention to its own situatedness, its ethical place in a changing world. Hunter's essay, though unacknowledged, seems at least in part to be a response to Philip Mason, who I won't have time here to go on about, but Philip Mason, who would argue in his book shortly before this, a book called Prospero's Magic, published in 1962, that racism essentially belonged to the lower classes, and that those who were in sort of elite populations were somewhat above it. And this is a point with which Hunter, I argue, take great contention. Finally, it's instructive finally to transpose the voice of my title so that I, as a scholar of color, am asking the question instead of hearing it. That is my title. And this is the most personal thing I will reveal today. It is indeed a question that I have been repeatedly asking as I watch whiteness play out in so many of the intellectual and institutional Shakespearean spaces around me. The question isn't just one I've heard, but one I've repeatedly asked again of work by a community of white Shakespearean members whose white melancholia unabashedly, perhaps so unconsciously, is put on display. The identification of the scholar of color with the pathologically personal symptomizes the fashioner here, not he who or she who is being fashioned. What's actually revealed is how the personal, as an underlying, remains unresolved and as something that is shiftable as a community of dominant discursive stories strain for gentlemanly authority and cohesion. We are in need, as one of the most consequential academic Shakespearean organizations in the world, of a more intellectual and ethical outing of what Erdeling calls the habits of austerity implicit in school training. So we may understand how our literary detour through Shakespeare's passion allows us to access identities, fashioned selves that are as deeply institutional as they are personal. To me, it seems both necessary and urgent for us to claim, to clarify, to borrow a word from Toni Morrison, our passions as our own. Was Shakespeare to him, or he to Shakespeare? The question here isn't a small one, and it isn't merely personal or academic. Without care, our institution runs the risk of turning my question in on itself and turning Shakespeare into a mere antiquarian object, an ancient exemplar for academics who so officiously feed on Shakespeare's global and local capital, turning what is deeply personal for others of us into impersonal fodder. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Arthur and everyone who invited me. Just a short note here. When I gave this title to Arthur, it was kind of long ago and far away. And since then, a term that I will be using a lot in my paper is affective community, which is kind of not here. So I use, can I just, this here? Just here, yeah. I use the term colorblind as a trope, a point of entry to consider how we can uncouple associations between Shakespeare's works and the canonical status within a regime of whiteness under the guise of universality. I recognize the negative freight carried by the word colorblind. August Wilson, through Western drama, The Ultimate Challenge, quote, "We do not need colorblind casting, we need some theaters to develop our playwrights," unquote. Here at the Shakespeare Association today, we have our playwright, Shakespeare, and issues of race, gender, performance, ethnicity, and so forth offer both a challenge and promise in mining his plays for productions of difference. And so the question before us today is how to make Shakespeare relevant to more students and scholars from minority and other marginalized populations, how to vary and multiply the colors of the profession. And to sum up, how do some canonical investments in Shakespeare, I think which Arthur and others pointed out, participate in the mapping of hierarchies of Anglo or the dominant white culture and civilization upon relationships of race, gender, ethnicity, class, etc.? A course description from an elite institution against which students protested as a requirement in 2016 states that the study of English poets as follows. It says that we must take up questions and problems, quote, that resonate throughout the whole of English literature, the status of vernacular language, the moral promise and perils of fiction, the relationships between men and women, the nature of heroism, the riches of tradition, and the yearning to make something new, unquote. In its claim, this syllabus takes up questions and problems, but it blithely erases the more vexing questions of racial, sexual, class dissonances, and of course, its glaring heteronormativity and homophobia, for instance. Therefore, many students who protested to this argued on the grounds that we need literatures relating to gender, race, sexuality, ableism, ethnicity, and so forth. I do not propose that a political straitjacket on scholarship and pedagogy, which should be broad and varied as we are, but I think we should keep in mind what Giovanni mentioned, what matters, whatever syllabus we are designing. So coming back to the stage, I believe that the stage is a really fertile and a productive site to mine some of these possibilities of inclusion that we are talking about today. And beyond textual scholarship, I believe the deployments of difference on stage, racial, gender, sexuality, can nurture a new, inclusive, affective community which beckons us to be members who refuse alignment along the secure axes of filiation to seek expression against or above possessive communities of belonging. This is a quote from Leela Gandhi's book, Affective Communities, Anti-Colonial Thought and the Politics of Friendship, 2006. And I think this idea of community that's affective sort of intersects in interesting ways with Arthur's notion of the personal that we can maybe pick up in the Q&A, because this is a personal community, a personal investment. So why is the stage important? And second, how are race relationships addressed on university campuses today? And I don't know if you're all obsessed with university and college websites that I am. Every university and college webpage has declarations of commitments to diversity and inclusions in the interest of the color of the profession. And when they describe actual practices, we see that diversity and inclusion are persistently described via a quantitative language of statistics, assessments, outcomes, that's a favorite word, or in platitudes about ideal mentoring. What this language of quantification does not evoke is a cultural imaginary whereby issues of race and inclusion can be mediated both cognitively and affectively. So my focus here today is to look at some productions of difference via various uses of color casting, and some of them may or may not even work. Color-coded, color-conscious, or so-called colorblind, or perhaps best, non-traditional casting, which actually explores these issues. And I, at the outset, would say I'm very greatly indebted to the work of Ayanna Thompson and Colorblind Shakespeareans, and that really set me on a very rich journey. And second, I'm only looking at, at the RSC and the Globe and the National, but a lot of very interesting work is being done all over. So specifically, I believe that some instances of non-traditional casting with fluid identity formations can unleash a vital poetic imagination that enables us to imagine a transnational or affiliative solidarity between diffuse groups and individuals. This is a part of that affective community. Theatrical experiments in non-traditional casting can awaken in surprised, confused audiences, perhaps, a capacity for personal hybridity and to recognize the importance of a radical alterity, and perhaps to embrace, as Leela Gandhi says, a world without taxonomies. And I just want to briefly look at Emma Rice's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which was in the Globe in 2016, which I think many of you may have seen and read about, and it's also on live stream. And then very briefly, just briefly look at some indirect dialogues on community and identity between three black actors, Adrian Lester, Hugh Quashie, and Lucien Mismati. Before I examine the concept of colorblind and look at some non-traditional casting, a concept, of course, as Ayanna Thompson and others have said, stirs controversy and always evokes the specter of racism behind assumptions of colorblindness on the stage. I briefly want to refer to a very ironic kind of horrific resonance this notion of colorblind has in Donald Trump's America. Making America great is, of course, clearly a synonym of making America white. But beyond and behind this slogan, the policies and practice of this administration, while purporting to be fair or colorblind, demonstrate the most targeted racist attacks on people of color imaginable in the democratic free world. The Muslim ban linking race to religion, expulsion of Mexicans, and the constant denigration of African Americans is just one example. So coming back to what is happening on the stage, as I said, the colorblind casting is considered very problematic, and even the Actors' Equity uses the definition non-traditional casting. And so what I want to suggest that in some forms of non-traditional casting, even while we have our social biases and affiliations, some promising issues can be raised. So Emma Rice's production of Midsummer Night's Dream, with its complicated mutations of race, gender, and ethnicity on the stage, is one striking example of a boundary-crossing theatrical performance that highlighted the provisional nature of all identities in this case. The immediate press reviews of this production were blithely celebratory, recognizing its topical and visual diversity, as well as its cross-gender casting, when Helena becomes Hellenist. But it makes no reference to its racial mixtures and casting of British Asian actors as Hermia and Hellenist and a black actor as Demetrius. The reviewers sort of take a kind of colorblind stance quite literally and ignore racial difference and the South Asian themes woven into the production. They barely mention that, the Demetrius is a black actor and a white actor, Edmund Darrington, plays Lysander. One reviewer says, what are we supposed to make of this weird, druggy, space-age Bollywood mashup? Nothing much, except that Shakespeare belongs now and then and here and there and everywhere. Another one says, I think perhaps more aptly, that this production is disruptive, unnerving, highly comic, but it cracks the surface of normality, and I think that's what interests me, and lets hallucination and truth escape hand in hand. And so, if any place is evoked in this, I think, in this play, and Emma Rice herself mentioned, it's glimmers of Indianness in the long, visible sensory spells of sitar music and so forth. But the idea of Shakespeare here, there, and everywhere, without being bound and gagged up some anthropological avenue, these reviewers' note seems to suggest pure entertainment eschewing any larger political agenda. So what is the significance of this mishmash of a production in casting, set, the gender realignments? In one obvious way, it disrupts associations between Shakespearean plot with whiteness and with pure Anglo civilization and culture. In terms of an affective community, we are in a company of a rag-bag group of characters, not all human or people, who experience psychic, sexual, cognitive, and physical dissonances and confusions. This production refigures affiliations and identities across gender, race, human, and non-human. It is an affective community, and at the end, a celebration of disruption of hierarchies, as in, the plot, when Theseus sides with the lovers over the authority of patriarchal laws. Other British productions, more directly of Othello, which has race as its theme, but which in the case of the 2015 RSC Othello has a non-traditional take of a black Iago, generate a very interesting actors' conversation that we have heard and read about. A dialogic exchange on the problems of race, identity, casting, and representation. Following interviews of black actors Adrian Lester, Hugh Quashie, and Lucien Mesmati, these actors bond, agree, disagree, and examine their relationship to the race-conscious world against which they represent racial difference on the stage. Here we have a reversal of the late Victorian rebels in Gandhi's book, The White Men Who Protested Against Empire. These are three black men navigating and enlarging their own communities of belonging and filiation to draw on the racial and gender mixed castes into an affective community on stage, but which shape continuing dialogues and disagreements outside in the cultures at large. Since, for the needs of time, I don't have time to quote all of them, but Adrian Lester is perhaps most utopian when he says, quote, "Soon we'll get to the point where race and class and gender of the actor will not matter." Lucien Mesmati, even though he endorses playing Iago as a black actor because it justifies, it explains the betrayal, he is very conscious of the way in which the color of your skin, as he said, shapes the parameters of your being. And Hugh Quashie, who had some resistance to playing Othello in the beginning, also is very, very thoughtful about the different kinds of communities black men, African men can mediate through the roles of Othello and Iago. So to finally kind of sum up, is that these brief examples from the mixed non-traditional casting on the British stage, I think, offer useful models of affective communities that I hope that in the Shakespeare Association we can consider to some extent. Michael talked of the word institution. I would like to use the word community and say that institutions are also bound by communities. And this is something that the John Quincy Adams, I think, saw a very different kind of community than we see today. And so what brings us together at the SAA and at the Folger, one of my favorite places, if I can say, is not any blithe sense of togetherness. The fault lines of tenure track, fixed term, lecturers, and our struggling graduate students, who we all love, are real, as well as the gendered, racial, and cultural lines, as Arthur pointed out, of people who say, well, I don't want to watch this stuff. And these are real and palpable on many occasions. But I still hope that we can access an affective community via a capacity for personal hybridity and radical alterity to take on other selves. As our friend Ian Smith, I don't know if he's here today, said in a recent article, we as Shakespeareans should acknowledge we are Othello. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Arthur in particular for welcoming me to speak in Jean Howard's place. And I'm just going to ask you to keep in mind Jean sitting in Pittsburgh trying to get here for 2 days and feeling really sad that she can't be the one to deliver this talk on which she's worked so long and so hard. The talk is entitled Self-Conscious Whiteness. For years, I've edited the Bedford contextual editions of Shakespeare. We have published 14 titles. By far, the most popular one is Kim Hall's edition of Othello. Why is that? Why is that, Jean asks. Well, it may be the glorious green color. The stage directions say wave edition, so I'm waving. Or the tantalizing array of materials Hall has assembled through which to consider the play. Early modern texts and images related to race and religion, cultural geography, marriage and the household, masculinity and military life, and the passions, for example. The excellence of the volume may simply be the source of its popularity. But I think there is more to be said. It is also popular, I suggest, because as a Shakespearean tragedy with a black protagonist, Othello speaks to current pressing issues, overt and covert forms of racism, black-white marriage, the intersection of race and sex, how racism affects the psyche of the racialized subject, and more. But just as importantly, Professor Hall's volume helps teachers, many of us white, to handle these complicated issues by way of the smart and thorough historical contextualization and the critical commentary that she, as a brilliant scholar and innovative teacher, provides. I'm speculating then that the popularity of Hall's Othello is linked both to a laudable desire to teach a race play and a certain self-consciousness in doing so, a hesitation about looking naive or ill-informed when, as a white subject, I talk about race with mixed classes of students. The situation can feel slightly risky. Used to holding forth about the intricacies of many parts of Renaissance culture, I may pause in the face of racial representation. Can I handle this well? Can I handle it if I have some African American students in the class? What if I have a lot of them? How do I get black and white students to talk to one another about race while dodging the bullet of liberal guilt, or making students of color play native informant or speak as representatives of their constructed racial identities? These questions may be in the back of my mind as I reach for Hall's edition. At this round table, we are talking about the color of membership, which I take to refer both most immediately to the membership of the SAA, basically white with widely scattered dots of color, but also about the faculties and student bodies of the schools where we professional Shakespeareans teach and where racial proportions are different. If most Shakespeare professors at the SAA are white, increasingly our students are not. This is true even at elite universities where faculties have diversified much more slowly than student bodies. We are now members of institutions where it should be embarrassing not to be ready to step up and address race in the classroom. Even as I rely on and learn from Kim's scholarship and editorial work, I know it's not the job of black scholars to make me comfortable teaching race. Rather, on a daily basis, it's up to me to try out, sometimes with difficulty and failure, the strategies and gain the knowledge that will make classrooms inclusive, which is not the same as making them comfortable or risk-free places. Higher ed at large is now grappling with the difference between diversity and inclusion, between adding color and having institutions change their identities and their operations as a result. While the SAA will now have, in the wonderful Ayanna Thompson, its first black president. What further changes will accompany and complement this signal event. Admitting more Black and first-gen students to the Ivy League has revealed to me how difficult it is without constant and intelligent activist effort for the presence of new members to change these institutions. The students at Yale asking the administration to change the name of Calhoun College were, whatever you think about the particular demand, simply saying, does it really matter that we are here now? What about this place can be different? A question for our general discussion might be, what could be different about the SAA now that there are more dots of color among our membership and many more students of color in our classes? Which leads me to a final point about whiteness. Our whiteness can make some faculty nervous about teaching race, which in America has often meant addressing Blackness, and we need to get over it. But more important than shedding such embarrassment is the challenge of becoming productively and critically self-conscious about whiteness as itself a racialized and powerful and privileged subject position, and to incorporate that knowledge into our professional lives in practices that may range from the glosses we write when we edit texts, to the kinds of theater history we create, to the kinds of questions we ask in a classroom, and the kinds of institutional practices we support. This requires often a reversal of the axis of vision and new questions. How is this text structured to make the experience of white male figures more important than the experience of Black female figures? Why do such texts largely make up our canon? How does white privilege blind this protagonist or character? How does it blind us as critics? We all know intellectually that whiteness is a racialized position, but under what circumstances does such knowledge disturb the comfortable houses that whiteness has built? The familiar practices by which it extends its hegemony, from determining what a race play is, that is, a play with Black characters, rather than one where whiteness is mobilized to oppressive ends, to deciding in advance what demands for change are responsible and which are simply irrational and outside the ideological common sense we have created and called fair. For me, the most arresting part of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me was his account of how he felt, was made to feel, his Blackness, and of the vulnerability of his Black body from the time he was a very young boy. Coates couldn't forget his race and the crushing power of the white world over Black men, because to do so was to increase the likelihood of being visited by violence and even death. Not many white subjects self-consciously inhabit their whiteness and its privileges in anything like the way Coates was made to inhabit his Blackness and to feel the injustices that followed from it. But we might ask, what changes would follow if we put the spotlight on whiteness and the long trail of consequences that have followed from its often unacknowledged power over the knowledge we make and the institutional practices we follow? The SAA is not the only or maybe the most important site for asking these questions, nor do I believe it is in crisis. But like most institutions, it needs to be self-conscious in all the right ways about how it does its business and how it helps its members, like me, to be better at the crucial job of work we, as professionals and intellectuals, are challenged to do now in Trump's multiracial and cruelly unequal America. Thank you.
Let me see if I can get this. Good morning, and thanks all of y'all for coming to hear us today. I'd also like to thank Lena Orland, Heather James, and the trustees for agreeing to initiate a self-reflective project on the futures of SAA. It's easy to get caught up in thinking of the future as only concerning us as individuals. But if we do think only in those personal terms, excuse me, Arthur, we ignore the means through which that trajectory ideally moves. I look out today and I see Angela Lee Cook, my dissertation director, who was the founder of the SAA in many ways as we know it today. I see my student, Drew Heverin, he's really smart, who is here at his first SAA meeting, and I know that none of us moves forward by ourselves. The SAA at its best is a clearinghouse, a facilitator, a mead hall, where you can meet people and form alliances and discover over time the lay of the land. It's good for us professionally, and it's been crucial for my own intellectual development. But when we don't pay critical attention to how SAA works as an institution, what it's good at, what it's bad at, how it can get better, we rob ourselves of a chance to make sure that the future looks like somewhere we actually want to work or to teach others how to do our job. My title was originally going to be Race and the Making of Shakespeareans, which would have allowed me to stroll backwards in time to the Mesozoic era when I was a graduate student and to my first time at this meeting as a regular faculty member. My SAA origins myth was back in the old days when Kim Hall and Margot Hendricks and I would be mistaken for each other. So maybe that's my superpower, shape-shifting like that. While I do believe that race is one of the institutional factors that makes a difference in how SAA functions as a place for intellectual work and professional development, that feels like a separate paper. And so I decided instead to focus my remarks on the printed title, Race and the Making of Shakespeare. What does race have to do with the Shakespeare we make in our own minds, that we profess to our various audiences, and especially that we teach to our students? Because I think that it's in our teaching, a means through which the Shakespeare we make in our mind has a far wider and deeper public penetration than the Shakespeare most of us write and publish about, where the connections between ourselves as Shakespeareans, our race, and Shakespearean text and performance becomes most visible and most enduring. I said enduring. I'm an optimist about teaching, and I think it's fun most of the time. I said I'm an optimist, but I'm not a fool. I would bet money that some of us in this room have lived through controversies in their own institutions, especially but certainly not exclusively public universities, about the content of their courses, the organization of their departments' majors, and their course offerings. A random check of any issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education will feature a story or two about professors at loggerheads with students who believe that course content or the professor's political convictions make it impossible for them to succeed in the course. Or a story about a professor whose politics or course content, or sometimes whose very presence, makes him or her a target of extra policing by university administrators or faculty or staff colleagues. I'm painfully aware of how many of these professors are women of color. Anthea Butler, Larisha Hawkins, Patty Duncan, Danielle Lee, Ursula Orr, Arij Zufari. Research conducted by the American Association of University Professors indicates that at the beginning of 2014, which I think are the most recent numbers they have available, Black full-time tenure-track faculty in U.S. colleges and universities make up only about 5% of the total number of tenure-track faculty. My own institution is a little below that average with 3.6%. My beautiful home Commonwealth of Kentucky is still one of the whitest states in the Union, with a non-white population of right around 13%. Our undergraduate student body is a little less white than it has ever been, but it is still more than 76% white. More than 15,000 of those undergraduate students are also natives of our very white state. Our university's public commitment to increasing the racial diversity of our faculty and our undergraduate student body, while admirable and determined in itself, stops short of recognizing the implications and consequences of this steady racial homogeneity. We are not only demographically, but structurally white. In my university's case, that whiteness was built and sustained against the background of a whites-only admissions policy for undergraduates that lasted until 1954, but whose afterlife lingers into the present. Powered in its turn by the steady state of our Commonwealth's racial makeup, the whiteness of my university has remained resistant not only to lasting institutional and structural change, but even sometimes to questioning the ways we treat each other, bringing things into light. Speaking frankly to ourselves about ourselves seems to me a vitally necessary first step in what David Roediger calls coming to terms with the ways in which the past bears on the present. Our institutional pasts and the past customs of our discipline bear on the ways we conduct our discipline in the present time. To forget or ignore these particular histories of how ideas about race become the basis of civic actions based on racism risk reducing the gravity of those ideas and the violence of their consequences to the level of an abstraction. We know now, again, if we manage not to notice before, that they are not. So, following my title, Race and the Making of Shakespeare, I assume that the whiteness of our institutional settings has helped to make us who and what we are as we function within those settings. I assume that whiteness speaks and acts on behalf of a set of affiliated racial interests which can manifest widely, from student evaluations that consistently judge black female faculty members' physicality and niceness, to tenure and promotion decisions that negatively judge the value of the kinds of scholarship that black candidates were hired to perform in the first place. But I also insist that even if race, especially whiteness, has made us, then we can also use race to make and remake Shakespeare. In doing that, we make new Shakespeareans. For some of us, the first way in which we can use race to make our Shakespeare is just by showing up in class. As I noted, I teach at a university that is both historically white and historically formed in whiteness. I know that y'all are a room full of high-class intellectual people, but if you care about college basketball, ask me to tell you sometime about Adolph Rupp, Texas Western, and the 1966 NCAA basketball championship. The only thing that Kentuckians care more about than good manners is basketball. We don't have that many black faculty. We don't have that many black female faculty. Some of our in-state students come to us never having had a black teacher in secondary school. So representation counts, and this is something I live with every day. At UK, we have built the idea of Shakespeare and race into our general educational requirement with a course called Global Shakespeare. Students looking to fulfill course requirements in one of two core areas can take this class, which my colleague Emily Shortsleff, Jean Howard's student, and I are now offering pretty much every semester. The section I'm teaching this semester serves students from 8 different colleges of the university, and I'm doing a section for our honors college this fall. So not only do we have a permanent institutionalized way of talking about Shakespeare in racial and international contexts, but it's also a 100-level class, which I'm really proud of, designed to serve primarily freshmen. The first Shakespeare class they take in college assumes that he lives in different cultural traditions, is performed across media, and communicates through asserting racial identities that are not always white or European. If we want to change institutions, thinking in structural curricular terms is one practical, effective way of trying to do that. In addition to always rewriting Shakespeare into our curricula and making the next generation of at least casual Shakespeare readers, Many of us here are also engaged to a greater or lesser degree in writing about the Shakespeare we see, the Shakespeare we want. The project of racing, or rather re-racing or unracing the making of Shakespeare, is thus implicitly historically minded. As I write about Shakespeare formed within the consciousness of authors following him, who have chosen explicitly to contest his status as a property of white authority, I discover along with them the cracks in the veneer of that authority, the clumsily patched places where we can see the supposedly natural affinity between Shakespeare and white authority begin to happen. I see the multiple ways in which that bargain between Shakespeare and whiteness has been struck, as well as some of the renegotiations and cancellations of those bargains counter-offered by readers and students and theater practitioners around the world. Drawing an analogy between the histories of institutions that bear uneasy relationships to the roles played by white dominance over non-white people, sometimes in their very founding, and the history of the appropriation of Shakespeare to the cause of whiteness reveals some of the same kinds of evasions, denials, and erasures of memory of how these foundations happened. Our public institutions, including Shakespeare, do have origins. Observing how race figured in those origins and how that racialized history bears on what we see today requires those of us who want to write about race in and Shakespeare not to forget or to ignore this fact. The past does bear on the present, yes, but the present also bears on the kinds of future that we want to make, to leave behind for those who follow us and take our jobs, if, that is, our jobs continue to exist. So we write, we teach, we go to committee meetings, and we become deans, and we refuse to forget. Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists for 5 extraordinary papers. Since we have only about 12 minutes until we break, I think it would be best if we just went to audience questions. The session is being recorded, so we need to have you amplified by a microphone if you're asking a question. And I do want to confirm, yes, I see a microphone right there. So please, if you would, and also if you would, ask questions of the entire panel.
Hi, thank you so much for such an invigorating, timely, important panel. I was wondering about, and I think you all sort of touched on this tonight, it was sort of spawned for me by, I think Jyotsna said something towards the end, about our graduate students, whom we all love. And I was thinking about how we show love to our graduate students, in particular thinking about the adjunctification, the limited jobs, and I think many of your papers sort of touched on, thinking about where do we start to set the groundwork for enabling larger representation for people of color in our profession. Is it with our undergraduates who get, Shakespeare in more diverse ways at the 100 level? Is it with the, making sure that we have spaces for, tenure track people of color, faculty, et cetera? So I would just love to hear you all sort of talk about, adjuncts, employment, the economic basis of inclusion for, faculty coming through. Thank you.
This is obviously a very large question. And one of the things I came across in my own research is how racialized the ranks of adjuncts are. So that's another place where we can see race helping to make Shakespeareans and helping to make the modern university. I'm not going to stand here and speak for people who are contract faculty. That's not my thing, and I hope that I made it clear in my paper that I was speaking from the experience I do know. One thing I hope becomes possible as long as we're talking about the futures of SAA and the futures of universities is that we make space within our organization for that conversation, as well as for more conversation generally about teaching. But that's what I have to say. Does anybody?
Yeah. Can I just add just briefly? I think about graduate students, it's really important not only that we help them in their publishing and jobs, and they're two of my very dear graduate students right here, but I also think the kind of sort of networks, the kind of mentoring and support systems we need. You know, we have in many very good universities, there's no support networks for graduate students. And so we, you know, try, and I think all of us try, is ways in which helping them enjoy and love the profession and not be caught up in too much competition. You know, just simple things like that, I think, make a lot of difference.
Other questions? Go ahead. Thank you for these talks. They're really invigorating. Each speaker today addressed the personal narrative, sometimes directly by talking about how personal things can be, and then also obliquely by referring to how events can become real and palpable. My request is to ask each of you to discuss the risks and rewards of offering personal narratives. The personal narrative is something that's discussed nowadays in many disciplines, from political science, sociology, anthropology, and thinkers from a broad range from Hannah Arendt to Judith Butler have talked about how the personal narrative enables us to empower ourselves, and they do it by punctuating and puncturing ideology and dogma. But however much personal narratives can empower, the speakers today have also discussed how they can narrow a discussion, and they can even invite a disavowal of interest in the topic. So I was hoping that each of you could address the risks and rewards of the personal narrative. Thanks.
Do you want to start? Arthur, why don't you start?
Okay. Thank you for the question. Not quite sure where to start with this. I'll try to keep this short. They're definitely a two-sided, as you're indicating with your question, issue at stake here, because the personal can also quickly become the testimonial, can become spectacle, and I know when I was writing my own paper, thinking about it, this was very much on my mind, was the sense of not wanting to sort of to turn what I was trying to talk about into, in fact, the personal, and so into the spectacle. And in part because of the way in which scholarship, I think for all of us, and this is in part, I think, what we're trying to get at on the panel, is at the end of the day also very, very local. And in the sense that there is an expectation almost in our culture that African Americans will sort of testify. And so part of what I was very conscious of was standing here and then telling certain narratives, and then having that sort of turn into the thing that we presumably as African Americans do. And so part of what I was trying to do, and I think a lot of us was trying to do, was to, including I think Jean, as Pat did that very, very well, is to try to talk about trying to demonstrate, illustrate how our subject positions, or us as subjects, is very much a part of all of our sort of scholarly enterprises. So I'm not quite sure if I'm quite getting at what it is that you were asking, but that's my immediate response to it.
What I'll say is that, I'm an old-timer at SAA. I've been here a long time. And so it's kind of inescapable that I see and experience myself here as a black female, a person in a black female body. So I can't not be personal. But I also know, since I'm part of a collective of people working together and living together and having conflicts together, I know that that personal beginning is only part of a larger whole. So I hope that I bring to my intellectual work, I hope I bring to my teaching, I hope I bring my body, because that's where I live, that's who I am. It's part of the story, it's part of how I do what I do, but it is not, all of it. And I wouldn't want to leave it behind me, because I couldn't.
I just want to speak as one of those immigrants. When I had a question, which is somebody asked me many years ago, why are you doing Shakespeare? Why don't you do something Indian? So that's when I decided to do Shakespeare in India. Just as my...
You're so hard-headed.
I'm going to be one of those obnoxious people with 3 things, but they'll be quick. Well, 2 of them will be quick. I thought I was, sorry. Am I speaking to the mic now? Okay, sorry about that. So first, my personal experience, I am really sick of every time the questions of diversity and inclusion come up, immediately people go, what about excellence? So I want to thank you for modeling for us how to have a conversation that is intellectual, that is excellent, that is about diversity and inclusion and about our lives. So please, praise to you for doing that and showing the city how it's done. So. My second thing is to add to Denis's list Otelia Cromwell, the first Black woman who got a PhD at Yale, whose dissertation was on Thomas Heywood. So not a Shakespearean, but yet a buried legacy, and we need to remember that we've been doing this for a long time. The third question isn't actually an institutional question. So I was on the strategic planning committee for the Shakespeare Association. Were we 2 years ago? I can't remember now. Time is just all fluid. But a lot of the, we got a line about diversity into the Constitution, but a lot of the questions that people asked at the business meeting, that people are asking on Twitter now, are in the strategic plan. A lot of diversity was kind of baked throughout. And so I'd like to ask the leadership, current and past, like what happened to the strategic plan document and how is, where we are with that. So, thanks.
So I thought somebody was going to address Kim's question.
I can't hear you.
Yeah.
So I think the question is for the SAA leadership, and we'll pass that along, and I know that'll be part of the discussion. Lena, if you would like to say a word. Here's a mic.
You're going to need that.
The committee to which Kim referred, which was chaired by Jean Howard, was an ad hoc committee called Strategic and Long-Range Planning for the SAA. It was a long and substantial document. We're still working through it. So that this year, for example, the members of the Board of Trustees received every year the board changes slightly. 3 people rotate off, 3 come in. So there are always new people, and this year the new group received the committee report again, and we're still working through it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lena. All right, we'll have the last, I believe it's the last question since we're coming up on lunch. Please.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Shakespearean scholars of color who have nurtured me since I started coming here. I felt lost, I felt like I didn't belong, I felt inadequate, and I felt like an imposter. But the most loving and brilliant and wonderful people who are still in this room have made me feel like I belong and I have a place. But I think that's every graduate student's, not just those of us of color, that's every graduate student's experience, perhaps. My question for this panel has to do with discussion and language. As recently, very recently, we get to a point when discussing things like race in the classroom, in Shakespeare, if you find that you are the only person of color in a room and a topic comes up that is difficult, that people find it difficult to talk about, there's a silence and then a moving past. I'm wondering, is there a way, how do you deal with that? That's it, that's my question.
Well, since I'm the teacher and I'm in charge, and there is a moment of silence, awkward silence, one thing that I have done that has been productive is to say, wow, nobody has anything to say about that, and make them talk about why they're reluctant to talk about it. Another thing that can be helpful that I have found that we're at a point where it's kind of a sticking place and you know that there's something there, but they feel too bashful to talk about it among themselves in class, you can ask them to write about it. It can be really helpful, like if you do like online responses or something like that, where they feel like they can speak more freely. Again, I teach a lot of young Kentuckians in my classes, and they've been taught how to act in public and how to have good manners. But the thing about good manners is that they keep you from, not only do they keep you from acting a fool, they keep you from saying and doing things that might make other people uncomfortable. So if you can get them not only to realize that being uncomfortable is not the worst thing in the world, but to find a way for them to speak anyway, like writing online or making anonymous responses, then that can be a way to kind of get off that spot and move forward, just in terms of, practical classroom management. But I try and tell them to pay attention when they don't want to talk about it, because that's usually pretty meaningful.
Okay, just before, I'm not answering that question, but just before Mike wraps things up for us, I just wanted to add just a couple of quick things. One goes back in part to Kim's question, even though, of course, I was not part of the strategic planning committee, that one of the things that I would like you all to think about when you respond to us, and we hope we do get some responses, and by the way, I'm not sure if you were going to say this about the napkin? Please go. That if you don't have our URL, it will be available at the Scholars of Color Social. We've had it printed on some nice little napkins for you, and so you can have a cocktail, a napkin, a URL,
So you put the napkin in your pocket.
Yeah, and even sort of do the whole thing while you were drunk or what have you. Anyway, we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. But in any case, what I would like to say is that that what I would like to encourage SAA to do is, after this initiative, the 3-year initiative is over, is to seriously think about, I think, using this slot right before lunch to think about it as a moment for us to have in the association a professional plenary. And what I mean by that is a plenary where we invite papers, et cetera, that's not focused on us reading plays and doing all the other things that we do at SAA, but where we get to think about how we work and how we operate professionally. And I think that one of the things that would do, and I think is very important for us as an organization in terms of moving away or to resist inertia, which can always very easily set in, is for us to have an ongoing conversation, and that would be, I think, take us a long ways towards inclusion. The other thing, more selfish than that, if that was at all selfish, is that all of the folks, the papers you heard today, are also not necessarily those essays, but are people who are appearing in White People in Shakespeare. And so that just gives you a sort of a sense of the volume that is, I hope, will be coming out soon. And so please look forward to White People in, yes, Kim, essay still need it, see that guilty look. All right, in any case, stay tuned for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur, and I just want to thank the panel for a terrific and focused discussion. Please, I hope that I can speak on behalf of the panel to say also thank you to the leadership of the RSA for... SAA. Sorry.
You almost made it.
Yeah, trying to get out to lunch. That's what's happening. To the leadership of the SAA for recognizing that a sustained and focused conversation about the color of membership is something that's important and that is important to foreground and put in this slot. I'd also like to invite everyone in the room tonight to come and see those fabulous napkins at the Scholars of Color Social tomorrow night. Sorry, don't put me in charge of anything.